So we're beginning to get closer and closer to closing the box, to proving our scientific theorem. Is he going to heal another man that's been sick longer than 38 years? We'll have to see. Is he going to send more angels to do more incredible work? We'll have to see. Is he going to change more water into wine? Let's try and see what happens next. Okay? It happens in the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. You see, John gives us 7 of these miraculous events. Okay. Starting with verse 1. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he'd performed by healing the sick. Everybody loves a good healing. I mean, we all know what it is to feel sick. It's awful. It's frightening. It's miserable for both the patient and all the people who care about them. We love a good healing. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw the great crowds coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Interesting question. He knew where there was bread available. He just didn't want to go buy bread. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. He must have been smiling. Philip, hey buddy, check the cash drawer and see if we have enough petty cash to go buy some bread for these folks. Now, he knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to even have a single bite." Another one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" When Jesus took the loaves, he gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same with the fish. And when they'd all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the pieces left over so that nothing is wasted." And they gathered and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over after everybody had enough. Okay, you ready? This is one of the most popular stories in all of the stories of Jesus, the gospel stories. The feeding of all the multitudes. One place it says 5,000, other says 4,000. Doesn't make any difference how many thousand. It was a big group. It was a big following. It was like the greatest gathering in all of recent history in one big spot. Now, when they gathered in Jerusalem, that was even bigger. That was a lot more impressive. But everybody had come to Jerusalem with the supplies they needed to stay for the festivals. Everybody brought enough so that they'd have, they knew they were going camping for several days a week at a time. They were going to make sacrifices, they were going to camp out. Most of them didn't have places to stay, so they had to bring enough that they could protect themselves and take care of their families. And they knew that was one of the things they're going to have to do, because they had to travel quite a distance even to get to Jerusalem. This was home, but they had just followed Jesus out into a desolate place, a place far away from any communities, away from any cities, away from any bread stores. And they had traveled out there without the intention of being gone that long, but they just got involved in listening to him, and they followed him, and were listening to the teachings he was giving them. And all of a sudden, all the stomachs began to growl. Oh boy, people getting restless. Oh man, what are we going to do now? I'm hungry. What am I going to... And Jesus knew what he was going to do. Knew what he was going to do. Did you know the little boy? I don't know. But he knew what he was going to do. You see, that's not the first time God ever fed people. It's the first time Jesus did. It's not the first time. See, we got to go back to our scientific theory. Our theorem is that God created our world. He is the sustainer of our world. He is the provider for our creation, our needs, our individual lives. God did this in the beginning, continues to do it on an ongoing basis, and will continue to do it until the end of time. Now that's our working theory. Stated very openly in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. This is our statement of our scientific theorem. But it didn't sound that strange to the people of Israel, the descendants of those Israelites who left Egypt, was it? It didn't sound that strange. Because for 40 years, God had provided food for them, both birds that flew close to the ground, that they could just reach out with a broom handle and go whack and have lunch. I want the wings. I'd like a thigh. Whack. But he also provided manna. Manna was a wonderful food. It satisfied the hunger. It satisfied your physical desires and needs. It was a health food of the highest order. I love thinking about going out every morning, looking around, saying, oh well, manna again. What's on the menu for today? Manna again. Picking up the food, putting it in a jar, taking enough just for that day, putting the lid on it, taking it into your home, and dipping it out 3 times a day to feed your family. When you got to the bottom of the jar, it had to be empty, because at the end of the day, everything left over is going to spoil. So you didn't go out and fill a half a dozen jars and set them in the closet, because the next morning it's going to stink. Bad. Okay. Except on Friday, when the manna came, on Friday morning. Then you filled 2 jars. Because in a miraculous way, the manna that was just for today would stay good, and the manna for the Sabbath would stay good. And you didn't have to go out and pick up the bread, the manna, the feast from heaven. It would stay just fine for a second day. But if you tried to make it stretch to 3, ooh, nasty stuff. Okay, you follow? God did that. Once. No. Twice? No. 40 years. 40 years. God met their physical needs every single day. kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Jesus said, let me show you how to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Give us this day our daily bread. Now that can't actually mean bread, does it? No, can't mean bread. I mean, God's not in the bread business, is he? God's not just your local baker. He's not your local grain farmer, milling grain and mixing it up and making bread with it. No. You see, I want you to just stop and think for a second. If God is, in fact, according to our scientific theorem, the one who knows all of the needs of all of his creation, Jesus said, consider the lilies of the field and how beautifully they are robed and clothed by God. And they don't spin and they don't weave, and yet God covers them with these beautiful, glorious coverings. Even though they're going to be gone in a day. One-shot deal. Think of the birds of the field. The birds flying in the air. God's aware of each one that comes to the end of their physical existence and drops to the ground. Does a quick tally to see how he's doing, so he knows just exactly how many sparrows are left. Knows you well enough to know how many hairs are on your head and exactly how many days you're going to live on this earth. Our theorem is that God knows, and God cares, and God provides for our needs. I want you to stop and think for a second. Here are these thousands of people out here in a desolate place, uncivilized place. They could have planted a garden, harvested their crops, cooked up some roasted ears, mixed up a few potatoes. But listen, God knows, and he wanted to show in his Son that he knows just as much today as he did back in those 40 years in the wilderness with the Israelites. Did he have to do it for 40 years? No. You have to understand, the Israelites forgot that they'd been fed by God almost as soon as it was over. A miraculous sign just has very little sticking power, because the next thing you say is, okay, what are you going to do for me next? But he does care. And when he prayed and blessed those elements of that food, that meal, it was going to be enough for everybody and more. You see, manna couldn't be saved. You couldn't waste it. But it could spoil. But they picked up 12 baskets full of barley loaves. Let me just give you a little hint. For the writer of the Gospel of John, every one of these miracles is a sign of superiority over Moses, who was the father of their nation. Abraham was the father of their physical DNA. He was the father of all of the Israelite people. But Moses was the author of the nation. He's the one who God gave the instructions to set up the laws and set up the tabernacle and set up their worship systems and all those kinds of things. Moses was the great nation builder. He was the lawgiver. He was the one who had the ultimate authority for 40 years to train them into a people and make them unified from a bunch of rowdy, rebellious slaves into a nation that could go in and capture the new land. He had a huge impact on the people of Israel. And with that, he was in a unique place to be the intermediary between God and the people. When God had something to say, he didn't speak it in words out of the tabernacle. He spoke it through his spokesman, Moses. When the people wanted to take their needs to God, they took it to Moses, and he took the words and the needs to God. It was important for Moses to be the one that they could physically see and touch and feel and connect with. They could look into his eyes and see who he was, how he felt. Was he angry? Was he filled with sorrow? Did he understand? Did he really listen? They could look into his eyes and see his face, and they could bring their needs to him as an individual, and he would go to God Almighty and present them. Well, that was the first miracle that Jesus did. The people were thirsty in Israel, in the wilderness. They had no water. They were in a very dry, very destitute place. And they came to Moses with all their concerns. They cried out to him saying, "We're dying of thirst here. Not only us, but all of our cattle and belongings and everything are shriveling up in the heat and we've got to have water." And so God speaks through Moses and says, "Strike this rock over here with your staff, and I'll take care of their needs." And water comes pouring out of a rock. A rock that suddenly becomes a fountain of water. Didn't stop the people from complaining very, very quickly again, but they at least had their needs met. In the same way, Jesus was confronted with the first miracle. There's no wine. The wedding festival is going to be a disaster. The family has been open and welcoming to all these groups of people, all the neighbors, the disciples of Jesus, the family of Jesus. They had everybody come to the wedding. It was a wonderful sense of hospitality. But now they didn't have enough supplies for everybody. The wine was gone. Wine was gone. Wine had been consumed. So what are you going to do? You're going to tell these people who've been so hospitable and so welcoming and so loving, sorry, you're going to look like a bunch of idiots for not being better prepared? No. And Jesus takes stone jars, stone, just like touching the rock, and out of the stone came water. Except this time, out of the stone comes wine. Now, do you follow what I'm saying here? What Jesus did is just one step better than anything Moses did. Very similar in form, very similar in pattern, but with one extra kicker on top to prove that Jesus was just the lawgiver, the nation builder, the ruler, the judge, the instructor. He was the one who gave everybody what they needed in order to become the new kingdom that he was putting into place. Now, instead of manna, it's barley loaves and fish. And you can pick up the pieces and save them for tomorrow, and it's fine. And you can take a picnic lunch home with you so you have stuff to eat on your way back home. Feeding of the 5,000, 4,000 in John. You see, it's an amazing miracle, and it's wonderful to remember that God cares. Jesus, as God's Son, performed the second miracle of manna in the desert. It's closing the circle and saying our theorem is becoming more and more clear that God is the creator. He does continue to create. He cares about his creation. He's deeply and intimately involved in creation. He is looking into the eyes of his created people, and he is caring for them and meeting their needs in Jesus, just as the Father did for the people of Israel in Moses' day. Okay, feeding of the 4,000. You ready for the next one? Okay, let's go for it. Happens in the same chapter, chapter 6. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. But now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." And then they were willing to take him into the boat. Okay. The Sea of Galilee is like an oval. It's not perfectly round. But almost all the way around it, it's surrounded by hillsides that are fairly steep on the sides. The Sea of Galilee sets in a rift valley, and it means it's very deep. It means it's very sharp on the edges, all right? And so when the wind blows, it blows down the hillsides and stirs the water, just like taking a spoon and slapping it on the side or the top of the water, and it stirs up the water and makes it very rough very quickly. Even today, the small boats that cruise around on the Sea of Galilee can get in trouble if a storm comes up fairly quickly, because the wind does the same thing. It's just like a spoon striking the surface of the water, and it gets very rough very quickly. It's about 7 miles across. You can look across and see the hillsides on the other side. It's not far enough that you can't see the other shore. So when the story of John, writing to us in the 6th chapter here, what he's saying is they had rowed hard against the headwind until they had gone 3 to 4 miles. Now, in a 7-mile wide lake, where are they located? They're right in the middle. They're in the middle of the mess. In the middle of the mess. They can't go forward. They can't get to Capernaum if they turn around and go back. The water's getting rough. Things are getting complicated. They're beginning to struggle. I mean, they're yelling at each other, pull harder, come on, we gotta push through this. The Sea of Galilee is home. They know what they've got to live with. They know what it'll do and what it won't. And they are facing a very interesting dilemma. They're stuck. They're stuck. Right in the middle of the lake. On purpose. Jesus comes walking across the water. just out for an evening stroll, walking across the surface of the lake. How many hundreds of feet deep? Doesn't make any difference. I'm not using that water anyway. I'm walking on the surface. Is that the miracle? Well, it is a miracle. It is an amazing story. It's an incredible event. Don't be afraid, it's me. And they allow him to get into the boat. Let me explain. As wonderful as that is, and how incredible it is, compared to the fact that God opened up the Red Sea and made it so that the people could walk across the Red Sea on dry ground. Isn't it cool? But in this case, didn't need nice wide paths for people to go through. He just walked across the surface. And then the miracle happened. You say, well, I thought the miracle was that he walked on water. Doesn't everybody laugh and say, well, if I could just walk on water, that's the miracle, right? No. No. This is number 5. And they were willing to take him into the boat. And then here are the words in verse 21. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now you've read that often enough. You know about him walking on the water, calming the storm, asking Peter to come out and walk on the water with him. All of those things are wonderful miracles. It's not, I'm not disclaiming any part of it. But when Jesus steps over the gunwale, the side of that boat, he needs to complete the journey that they started without him. And the boat and the people and all of the equipment and everything that they had with them was instantly transported 3 to 4 miles instantaneously to exactly the place they were originally intending to go. That's a miracle. That is number 5. Our scientific theorem is that God is in control of all of the elements of the universe. He can control the atoms and bring atoms and things together so that elements that are not in the stone jars are brought into and brought in complete harmony, and so water becomes wine, even though there aren't the atoms to make those things happen there at that moment. He has the ability to recreate the body of a man who's been invalid for 38 years, as all those things. He has the ability to create food that would provide for all those thousands of people on the hillside. He was telling us in this 6th chapter of John something very special. Because you see, we live in a time of very interesting scientific realities. We're about ready to send people back to the moon since all those decades before. Put them in a starship, send them up to the moon. Elon Musk is trying to build a rocket. It'll take 100 people to Mars. If God wanted 100 people to Mars, he could just simply pick them up and transport them there instantaneously. Doesn't need a starship. Doesn't need rocket fuel. Doesn't need a propellant or an oxidizer. God's in control of all of the elements of time and space. And he proved it in this one miraculous event. Yes, he walked on the water, and I'm sure that's very impressive to people who can't. It doesn't say they fell asleep and somehow Jesus figured out how to get the wind to stop and then propelled the boat at high speed across the lake to finish their journey. It doesn't say they all went thrusting forward and flew to the back of the boat. It doesn't say that the wind stopped and they were able to change direction. It doesn't say the wind turned around and came from behind him and pushed him ashore. It says, in spite of all the elements that were there, Jesus simply took them en masse as a group and put them where they needed to be. And put them where he wanted them to be, in space and in time. In space and in time. Now, maybe John didn't understand space travel like we do. Maybe John didn't understand rocket travel and trajectories and loft and lift and all the other kinds of things that was there. Didn't have an internal combustion engine that could propel the thing across the lake. Didn't have GPS to say just exactly where are we supposed to be going here and how far, how many degrees do we have to adjust our course to make sure that we arrive where we're hoping to go. Jesus just took them instantaneously to where he wanted them to be, where they were supposed to be. Our scientific theorem is getting closer and closer to being closed. Proved. Because now we have reproduced our scientific theorem that God is in control of all of the elements and possibilities of creation. He cares about who we are, and he cares about who we are and how we're dealing with things, and brings the eternal power of God himself into our world to make sure we understand who he is and how he's working to benefit us and to bring us into harmony with him. Okay, we got 2 more to go. Number 6 is back here in chapter 9. It takes a whole chapter. I can't read it for you. But here's what the story is. Chapter 9, verse 1. As he went along, he saw a man born blind from his birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be on display in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. And night is coming when no one can work, but while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Very important words there. I am the light of the world. Again, this is in direct connection to the first chapter of the Gospel of John that sets down our scientific theorem that we're trying to prove. The light came among us. We did not receive him. We did not recognize him, but he had the light of life. He was the light. And so this is to close the deal on the scientific theorem in chapter 1. After saying this, he spit on the ground and made some mud with saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, and wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So that the man went and washed and came home seeing. All right. I call this story The Boy with the Misshapen Eyes, because the phrase is, he was blind from birth. He was born blind. Now, a couple of simple little observations to give you a background on it. We don't always know when a child is born whether or not their eyes work perfectly. It's kind of in a developing area of science where they actually start to begin to do some analysis of whether or not a person's vision works as well as it should. And I see very, very young kids wearing corrective lenses and things more than I have, through the rest of my life. So they're getting a developing science to this, but most people don't know whether or not a child can see. We look at the child, we see their eyes, it's wonderful. For me, I didn't know whether my child even had eyes for about the first 3 days, because Jonathan kept his eyes screwed completely shut 100% of the time, and it was kind of a pleasure to realize he did have eyes in there when he finally stopped screaming and began to relax and accept the reality that he was now outside in the real world and might as well enjoy it. Okay? So, we don't always know if our child has vision available to it or not. But this boy was obvious to everybody. He did not have the equipment with which to see. That way they knew, without any question, this boy who had been born with the misshapen eyes could not see. He didn't have the tools to see. His eyes were not able to capture the light and see it and process it and send the signals to the brain that we can recognize the objects of light and dark and recognize people in the way we. Now, I've learned in the time since starting this ministry that one of the problems that we have with children is if their eyes don't work very well, the optic nerve that runs from the eye to the brain doesn't develop correctly. And so the optic nerve requires the eyes to be able to send the signal from the very first day of that child's life so that the nerve can develop this pathway back and forth to the brain so that we can actually visually recognize shapes and colors and signs correctly. And if the eyes do not function correctly, the nerve shrivels and dies. And then vision is not possible even with major corrective surgery. So children are operated on or helped in some way so that they can see, so that the optic nerve develops also, not just the outside eye that we can visualize, but the nerve that we can't see that goes to the brain. Okay, so having said all of that, I wanted to just share with you this chapter, the entire investigation into Jesus, the entire question of why this man claims to be the man who was born blind, and he's easily recognized because he has these misshapen eyes, and now all of a sudden his eyes are able to see, and it's obvious that he's got working, functioning eyes where he'd been the boy with the misshapen eyes before. It's an amazing miracle, an amazing story. It takes a whole chapter where the man is investigated in every possible way to see if this is a legitimate proof of who Jesus Christ was. There weren't a lot of people witness the event, and that was on purpose. Jesus put mud coverings over the places where the miracle was going to happen. The mud didn't cure him. The mud didn't create new eyes. It hid the miracle. It covered the place where the tragedy had lived until God had put the miraculous in place. And as soon as the mud was washed off in the cleansing, he could open his eyes and have perfect vision. New eyes had been created. New optic nerve had been stimulated and built between the eyes and the brain. He had full functioning sight in every way. He got a chance to see his mother and father for the first time in his life. Exciting, huh? Well, not really. It came at pretty high cost. You read the story, please. But one of the phrases that just shocks me all the way to my heart. Has anyone ever seen this kind of power before? Has anyone ever seen someone who was born completely unable to see be given restored sight, given new eyes? No. No. There's only one place that comes from. The Creator of all things, the light that came into the world. And all we have to do is open our eyes to see it. It's almost closed. You see, our proof of who Jesus is almost complete. Almost complete. Time and space, molecules, forces of nature, specific gravity, time travel, all these things, the human biological machine and how it works and how it can be restored, all of those things are forming this great scientific conclusion, reproduced over and over and over again, that the theorem we have is being confirmed. Not quite there yet. One more to go. It happens in the 11th chapter of John, and this is the 7th. For John, 7 has a significance because it means it's complete. 7 is like the days of the week. It means a complete week. 7 is the sense of when God worked to create the world. It took 7 days. Even on the 7th day, he rested. 7 has a very high importance into John's gospel, and so he wanted to give 7 different proofs, and he chose these 7 to share with us because he wanted us to be able to realize he didn't leave anything unfinished. It's only just part of the story. No, it's the whole story. And here's where the whole story comes to its conclusion. In the 11th chapter of John, Jesus comes to his friends, Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, 4 days after Jesus had been told that Lazarus was at the point of death, and Jesus refused to go to take care of his friend, and finally he decides to go. Mary and Martha come running out to him. If you'd only been here, Jesus, you could have kept our brother from dying. In the 38th verse, chapter 11, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been in there 4 days." Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out with his hands and feet wrapped with the strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Go take off the grave clothes and let him go." What's the missing piece? I said we've just about got it closed. We've almost proved our scientific theorem. What's left? What's the missing piece left? Does God have the power to recreate a body physically? Well, the man who had been invalid for 38 years basically had a new physical body, with it being restored and turned back into a healthy body. Remember my aunt, all crippled, and then suddenly this man is made whole? Doesn't that prove already that God has the authority to recreate a body that's been sick? And, well, we love healing miracles. Doesn't that show that he has authority over diseases? Things like leprosy, viruses, bacterias, genetic problems, DNA problems, all kinds of issues. I mean, doesn't the Gospel of John already have that proved? What are we trying to prove here? Here's the man that was born blind, and suddenly he goes from having no eyes to having perfect eyes. He can see perfectly, and the optic nerves and everything else. His brain is set up to receive that sight and to receive it as a mature person who can see and not just strange images. I mean, he can literally walk down the street and know not to run into a wall. I mean, come on, this is not just a child seeing for the first time. This is a mature individual who sees as a mature individual. Isn't that interesting? Okay. I find it fascinating. God had that power. All right. Well, let's think about this for just a second. What's required to have the miracle of Lazarus coming back to life? Well, we know the first thing is he's got to have a body. You can't have a healing without a body, right? And so, at the command of Jesus, at the command of the commander-in-chief of all the heavenly forces, a body is made that was identical to the body of Lazarus. That goes without saying. I mean, right? You follow that if this is going to be a perfect miracle and people are going to come to a party and talk to Lazarus and look at Lazarus, and they're going to see if he has the same scars, if he has the same mole on the back of his ear. I mean, they're going to make sure that this is the same Lazarus that they've always known. They're going to talk to him to see if he's brain dead, or does he feel the same? Does he remember the same? Is he the same Lazarus that they knew? So you have to recreate an identical body for Lazarus. And so in a moment of time, without any real hesitation or, not even Scotty beaming down someone from the Star Trek Enterprise can do it instantly. It takes a little while to go. Not in this case. There's instantly a body lying there in that tomb that's identical to the one that Lazarus left 4 days before. All the elements of decay have already destroyed what was there originally, and the new one has been completely created. And then there's something else that has to happen. Life has to go back into that body again. Oh, that's a little harder for me to explain. What's the one thing we can't do now, 2020? We can't take the chemicals and all the proteins and all the, things that make up our DNA and all the other kinds of things we'd like to create and zap it so that it starts to become a living tissue. Life is something very unique and special beyond just the chemical makeup of what's there. We need the chemicals. I can't live without the chemicals. We have to have the reactions. When we eat a strawberry, it goes down into our system, and some amazing chemical plants down in there take that strawberry and take out of it the nutrients that our muscles and tissues and nerves and fibers and brains and all the other kinds of things need, and they are filled. Chemically, it's an amazing process. But we can't make it into a living tissue even this late along in our scientific development. And so there's that sense that even if we could create this perfect body, which we can't, we couldn't make it live. The Frankenstein movie just doesn't happen. Dead tissue doesn't become living tissue. There's a third miracle. You have to return the spirit of Lazarus back into the body and the life of the body. There are 3 parts involved in this thing. They're all hooked together, and they have to happen exactly at the right time, because a body has to be created, it has to be brought back to life, and then it has to have everything that Lazarus has been in his entire life reinstalled into that CPU. I'm sorry. It kind of sounds stupid. But if you take the bare bones computer, and it's got all the operating parts, you have to load an operating system on it to be able to get it to function. As crazy as that sounds. And it is crazy. I'm sorry. I apologize for that strange picture. But if you don't have the spirit of Lazarus, it doesn't make any difference if there's a body. It's just an invalid laying there without any kind of memories or emotions or insight or anything. Even if the molecules in the DNA are exactly what you need, you still don't have a functioning Lazarus. I could spend the entire week just talking to you about the miraculous event that it takes to bring back someone who has been dead for 4 days, bring them back into a new body. But I'm going to just summarize it this way, just as simply as I possibly can. Jesus did this miracle in front of thousands of witnesses who had emptied out of Jerusalem and traveled the 2 miles, just a little less than 2 miles, to the city of Bethany. They knew Lazarus. They understood Mary and Martha. They had been grieving for 4 days as Lazarus had been in the tomb. The grieving process was still very well along. They loved Lazarus. He was their friend. He was an important man. And standing there in front of the tomb, Jesus recreated the Genesis 1 event. Jesus simply spoke the words that Genesis, the first chapter, says brought everything into creation. He was the Word of God. He called everything out of nothingness. Ex nihilo is the old phrase they use, from nothing. He spoke the words, and all the things that needed to be done were done. Everything that was created came from his command, his word spoken out that put it into action. John 11 ties directly to Genesis 1. Genesis 1 said, in the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God created. And in this one event, he created the one thing that proved that Genesis 1 was true. That John, the first chapter, was true. Scientific theorem that said God is in control of his universe, in control of his creation. He's intimately involved in it from day one until now. He is continuing to provide divine instructions to all the elements and forces of nature, and he is still the one calling the shots on what is happening and what is not. And John closes the loop with this last one, saying not only is he in charge of our bodies, not only is he in charge of our lives, he is in charge of our spirits and where they go after death and when they can return back to this side of eternity. That's what closes the loop on John's scientific investigation. It leaves nothing to chance. There's nothing left unanswered. John finishes connecting all of the history all the way through the Old Testament, all the way back to Genesis, the first verse, to right here. God was standing in the middle of his universe, in front of that tomb, still commanding every element, time, space, chemicals, protons, neutrons, citrons, I don't care where you call them. He's the one who is the one in control. And it proves the scientific theorem that John started with in the very first chapter of John, saying, this is what I'm hoping to prove, because I've seen it myself. I witnessed it. I stood there. I heard the prayer of Jesus. I recited word for word for what he said, and this is exactly what took place. Case proved. Jesus is the Son of God. The Word that was with God in the beginning and through whom everything was created that now exists. Thank you. Thank you. God bless you.